The transport shuttle descended through clouds of purple gas and broke into clear sky above the most beautiful and terrifying place Lyra Vance had ever seen in her 26 years of life. The Celestine Military Academy stretched across an entire moon, its towers of black glass and silver metal reaching toward the stars like the fingers of some ancient god reaching for heaven itself. Lyra pressed her face against the window and watched as hundreds of smaller ships moved around the station, carrying cadets from every corner of the known galaxy to this one place where warriors were made and legends were born. She was the first human to ever receive an invitation to this academy, and she knew that billions of people back on Earth were watching her journey. With hope in their hearts and pride in their eyes, the shuttle landed with a soft thump and the doors slid open. With a hiss of releasing pressure, Lyra stepped out onto the polished obsidian floor and immediately felt very small and very alone in a way she had never experienced before in her entire life. All around her stood beings from dozens of different species, and every single one of them was looking at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to amusement to open contempt. A Korvoth warrior walked past her, his massive frame covered in natural armor that looked like plates of living stone, and he stood nearly 3 meters tall with arms thick as tree trunks. Glanced down at Lyra and made a sound that might have been laughter before continuing on his way without a second look. A group of Rin cadets skittered by on their 6 legs, their insectoid bodies moving so fast they seemed to blur at the edges, and their compound eyes reflected Lyra's image 1,000 times over. They did not even slow down to acknowledge her presence. Lyra took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here and what she had sacrificed to earn this chance that no human had ever been given. Before she walked toward the intake processing center with her head held high and her shoulders squared against the weight of 1 billion expectations. The processing center was a massive circular room filled with floating screens and scanning equipment that hummed with energy beyond anything human technology could produce. A tall figure made of pure light approached her and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Cadet Lyra Vance of Terra, please step into the assessment chamber for your initial evaluation. Lyra did as she was told and stood in the center of a ring of blue light while machines she could not understand scanned every part of her body and mind. The results appeared on a massive screen that everyone in the room could see, and Lyra felt her stomach drop as she read the words that would define her. Time at this academy: species Terran human, natural armor, none venom glands, none telepathic ability, none electromagnetic sensitivity, none regeneration factor, minimal reflexes, below galactic average strength, bottom 15% speed, bottom 20% composite combat potential. Score 4,000 out of 4,000. She was ranked dead last among every single cadet at the entire academy. The room fell silent for a moment before the laughter began, starting as a few quiet chuckles and building into a wave of mockery that crashed over Lyra from every direction. She stood there and let it wash over her without flinching and without showing any sign of the shame that burned in her chest like a fire that would not go out. A Velthari cadet made of living crystal walked up to her and looked her up and down with eyes that sparkled like diamonds filled with starlight. You are the human, the Velthari said in a voice like wind chimes in a storm. I am Desik, and it appears we have been assigned as roommates for reasons I cannot begin to understand. Lyra nodded and tried to smile in a way that did not look as forced as it felt. Nice to meet you, Desik. The crystalline being made a sound that might have been a sigh. Come, I will show you to our quarters, though I suspect you will not be staying long enough to make the journey worthwhile. They walked together through halls of gleaming metal and past training rooms where cadets performed feats that seemed impossible to Lyra's human eyes. A Mindarin sat in meditation, while objects floated around her, head in complex patterns, controlled only by her thoughts. A Cassith practiced combat forms with claws that dripped venom, capable of killing a dozen humans with a single drop. A group of Selenith worked together to lift a piece of equipment that must have weighed several tons, their 4 arms moving in perfect coordination, and everywhere she went, Lyra saw screens displaying the Academy rankings. Everywhere she looked, a name sat at the very bottom, like an anchor, dragging down the reputation of everyone near it. Their quarters were located at the far end of the residential wing, as far from the training facilities as physically possible, and the room itself was barely large enough for 2 beds and a small desk. Thesic took the larger bed without asking and began arranging crystals on a shelf that glowed with soft inner light. I will be honest with you, human, Thesic said without turning around, because I see no point in being kind when kindness will not help you. Lyra sat on her small bed and waited. You should withdraw from the Academy before the culling trials begin in 6 weeks, because those trials will destroy you in ways that will leave scars on whatever passes for a soul inside your soft and fragile body. Lyra looked at her hands, small and weak compared to the claws and armor and weapons that grew naturally from the bodies of her fellow cadets. Why do you say that? She asked. Thesic finally turned to face her, and there was something almost like pity in those crystalline eyes, because humans were not built for war, and this academy exists for no other purpose than to create the finest warriors the galaxy has ever seen. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Earth and the people who had sent her here, and the weight of being the first of her kind to walk these halls. Then she looked up at Thesic and smiled, and there was something in that smile that made the Velthari feel suddenly uncertain in a way that crystals were never supposed to feel. We will see, Lyra said that night, while Thesic slept in perfect stillness. Lyra crept out of their quarters and made her way to the training facilities that glowed with soft light in the darkness of the station's night cycle. She found an empty room and began to train, pushing her weak human body through exercises that left her gasping and shaking on the cold metal floor. She trained until her muscles screamed, and her lungs burned and her vision blurred with exhaustion. And then she trained some more because Lyra Vance knew something that no one at this academy understood yet, something that humans had learned through 200,000 years of surviving on a planet that had tried to kill them every single day. She knew that the race did not always go to the swift, and the battle did not always go to the strong. Sometimes it went to the one who simply refused to stop. The first week at the Celestine Academy taught Lyra what it truly meant to be humiliated in front of thousands of beings who saw her as nothing more than a joke that had somehow wandered into their world. The strength trials were held in a massive arena with floating platforms and gravity fields that could be adjusted to simulate conditions on 100 different worlds. Lyra stood in line with her fellow cadets and watched as a Corvette named Draven stepped onto the central platform and lifted a ground transport vehicle above his head with a roar of triumph that shook the walls. The crowd cheered as he threw the vehicle across the arena like a human might throw a ball. When Lyra's turn came, she walked to the platform and faced a set of weights that the others had used as warm-up exercises before moving on to the real challenges. She grabbed the bar and pulled with everything she had, her face turning red and her arms shaking with effort, and she managed to lift it just high enough to count as a successful attempt. The silence was worse than laughter would have been. The speed trials came next, held on a track that twisted through 3 dimensions and required cadets to navigate obstacles while being timed down to the microsecond. The Vrin cadets moved so fast that Lyra could barely see them as they completed the course in times that seemed impossible to her human brain when she ran the course herself. She finished dead last by such a massive margin that the instructor did not even bother recording her time in the official results in the psionic defense trials. Cadets were required to protect their minds from telepathic intrusion by trained Mandarin instructors. Lyra sat in the testing chamber and felt the alien mind push into her thoughts like fingers sliding through water, reading her memories and emotions and fears as easily as a human might read words on a page. She had no defense against it, because humans had never evolved any form of mental protection. And she sat there exposed and vulnerable while the Mandarin instructor shook her head in disappointment. "There is nothing here," the instructor announced to the watching cadets. "Her mind is completely open, like a door that cannot be closed." The laughter that followed haunted Lyra's dreams for weeks. Instructors began to use her as an example of what not to do, calling her to the front of training sessions to demonstrate how easily a poorly evolved species could be defeated. Cadets made jokes about her in the halls and dining areas, creating mocking nicknames that spread through the academy like a disease. Someone started a betting pool on which trial would finally break her spirit and force her to withdraw from the program. And the pool grew larger with each passing day. Footage of her failures appeared on the Academy's social networks, edited together with music and commentary designed to maximize her humiliation. But something strange was happening that no one seemed to notice except for one person. The RN was a Solineth medical officer with 4 arms and eyes that could see into spectrums of light that humans could not even imagine. And she had been assigned to monitor the health of all cadets in the residential wing where Lyra lived at first. She had expected the human to break down within days, requiring treatment for the psychological trauma that surely must come from such constant failure and mockery. Instead, she noticed something that made no sense. According to everything she knew about biology and evolution, the human kept going when other cadets trained for 2 hours and went to rest. Lyra trained for 8 hours and collapsed in her quarters, only to wake up and do it again when she failed the obstacle course for the 47th time. She got back up and tried again. And on the 48th attempt, she completed it with blood running down her legs and arms when the telepaths invaded her mind and exposed her deepest fears. She did not hide from those fears, but instead studied them and learned how to use them as weapons. The RN began running unauthorized scans on the human, comparing her current physical state to the baseline measurements taken during intake processing. What she found made her question everything she had learned in centuries of medical training. Lyra's muscle fibers had grown denser and stronger, adapting to the demands she was placing on them in ways that should have taken years of evolution. Her neural pathways had reorganized themselves, creating new connections that improved her reaction time and pattern recognition. Her pain tolerance had increased by 40%. And her body was producing chemicals that helped her recover from injury faster than before. Impossible, Dorin whispered as she reviewed the data in her private office late at night. She had studied hundreds of species across the galaxy, and almost all of them reached a stable biological state after maturation that did not change significantly, regardless of external pressures. But humans were different. Humans could push themselves beyond their limits and somehow create new limits to push against. They could break themselves down and rebuild themselves stronger than before. They could adapt. Dr. Arin looked up the humans' training records and saw that Lyra had logged more hours in the facilities than any other cadet in the academy, often training through the night cycle when everyone else was asleep. She pulled up footage from the security cameras and watched the small human struggle through exercises that would have been easy for a Corvath child. She watched Lyra fail and fall and bleed and cry in frustration, and she watched again back up every single time the Selenith doctor sat alone in her office and felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Something that felt almost like fear mixed with a strange kind of respect. She began keeping detailed records of the human's physical changes, documenting every improvement, no matter how small, building a file that would eventually become the foundation for a new field of xenobiological study. Meanwhile, Lyra continued to train in the shadows of the academy, invisible to everyone who had already dismissed her as a failure. Not worth watching, she studied the weaknesses of every species she faced, learning their pressure points and vulnerabilities, and the tiny gaps in their natural armor where a well-placed strike could bring down even the mightiest warrior. She read everything she could find about tactics and strategy, absorbing knowledge that would let her brain compensate for what her body could not do. She watched the other cadets train and memorize their patterns and habits, looking for the moments of hesitation and overconfidence that she could exploit when the time came. And she did all of this while ranked dead last in an academy that had already forgotten she existed. The culling trials were approaching, a brutal test that would eliminate half of the cadets and send them home in shame. Everyone expected Lyra to be among the first to fall, but in the quiet hours of the night, when the academy slept and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, a small human with no armor and no claws and no psychic powers trained herself into something new, something dangerous, something that the galaxy had never seen before and would soon learn to fear. The morning of the culling trials arrived with a silence that hung over the academy like a heavy blanket, pressing down on every cadet who understood what the next few hours would mean for their future. 4,000 cadets had entered the Celestin Academy 6 weeks ago, and by the end of this day, only 2,000 would remain. The rest would be sent home in shame, their dreams of military glory shattered forever. Lyra stood in the staging area with the other cadets and felt the nervous energy that crackled through the air like electricity. Before a storm, no one stood near her or spoke to her because everyone knew that the human would be among the first to fall, and no one wanted to be associated with such obvious failure. The rules of the culling trials were simple in their brutality. Each cadet would face opponents in simulated combat scenarios of increasing difficulty, fighting until they either surrendered or were incapacitated by their injuries. The simulations used technology that made the pain feel completely real, and the injuries would heal once the trial ended. But the trauma of experiencing them would remain forever in the mind. Lyra had studied the history of the trials and knew that some cadets never recovered from what they experienced. In these arenas, the first round began, and cadets were called one by one to face their opponents in the fighting pits, while thousands watched from the observation platforms above. Lyra waited for her name, knowing that the organizers had probably placed her first to get the obvious elimination out of the way so the real competition could begin. Cadet Lyra Vance of Terra versus Cadet Xerix of the Vring Collective. A murmur of anticipation ran through the crowd as Lyra walked to the arena floor and faced her opponent. Xerix was a nightmare of chitin and speed, standing on 6 legs with 4 arms that ended in claws capable of cutting through metal like paper. The ring could move faster than the human eye could track, and Lyra knew that she had no chance of matching that speed in direct combat. The signal sounded and Xerix became a blur of motion, crossing the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. Pain exploded across Lyra's face as a claw struck her cheek. More blows followed before she could even register the first one, hitting her ribs and arms and legs in a storm of violence that sent her crashing to the ground. The crowd watched in satisfied silence as the human struggled to rise, blood dripping from the wounds that covered her body. Xerix stood over her and made a clicking sound that passed for laughter among the Vrin. "Stay down, soft one," the insectoid said. Your suffering is meaningless. Lyra looked up at her opponent through eyes that were already swelling shut from the damage. And then she stood up. The crowd went quiet in a way that felt different from before. A confusion replacing the satisfaction they had expected to feel. Xerix struck again, faster this time. Determined to end this embarrassment and move on to more worthy opponents, Lyra fell and rose for 11 minutes. She endured punishment that would have killed most species in the galaxy, absorbing blows that shattered bones and tore flesh and should have shut down her nervous system from pure overwhelming pain, but she kept getting up. Xerix began to slow, not from exhaustion but from something the Vryn had never experienced before in a life spent as a predator at the top of the food chain. Fear. Why would this creature not stay down and accept defeat like every other being the Vryn had ever faced in combat? What kind of species refused to submit, even when submission was the only logical choice? In that moment of hesitation, Lyra moved. It was not fast by any standard that mattered in the galaxy, but it was unexpected. And she had spent weeks studying the Vryn anatomy and memorizing the location of every nerve, cluster and weakness in their impressive armor. Her fist connected with a spot just below the Vryn's primary sensory cluster, hitting the nerve bundle that controlled motor functions with all the desperate strength. She had left Xerix collapse to the ground, unconscious before the insectoid even understood what had happened. The arena fell completely silent for 3 long seconds. Then the chaos began. Cadets who had bet on Lyra's immediate elimination screamed in anger, and disbelief instructors exchanged confused glances as they tried to understand what they had just witnessed. And somewhere in the observation platform, Diarin smiled quietly and made another note in her growing file on human physiology. The next rounds blurred together in a haze of pain and determination. Lyra faced a telepathic Mindarin who tried to invade her thoughts and control her actions. But she had prepared for this by flooding her own mind with the most traumatic memories she could summon. The Mindarin recoiled in horror as images of human history poured into its consciousness. Wars and famines and plagues and atrocities that the peaceful psychic species had never imagined any being could survive, while the Mindarin struggled to process the darkness that humans carried within them. Lyra struck and won. She faced a venomous Cassith who bit her arm and injected enough poison to kill a dozen members of most species. But human immune systems had evolved on a planet filled with toxins and parasites and microscopic enemies that attacked from every direction. She held on as the venom burned through her blood, refusing to let go of the Cassith's throat until her reptilian being finally surrendered. She faced warriors with natural armor and warriors with unnatural speed, and warriors who could see the future and warriors who could bend light around themselves and disappear. She lost every physical contest by every measurable standard, and she won anyway. When the culling trials finally ended, Lyra Vance stood among the 2,000 cadets who had survived, her body broken in ways that would take weeks to fully heal. Even with the advanced medical technology of the Academy, her ranking had climbed from 4,000 to 1,893. She was still near the bottom, but she was still here, and that fact sent shockwaves through an institution that had never seen anything like it. That night, as she lay in the medical bay recovering from her wounds, Thesic visited her for the first time since they had become roommates. The crystalline being stood at the foot of her bed and stared at her with an expression that Lyra could not read. "How?" Thesic asked, and there was no mockery in the question, only genuine confusion and something that might have been the beginning of respect. Lyra smiled through cracked lips and swollen eyes. "I told you we would see." Thesic was silent for a long moment, processing this information through a mind that was used to the certainties of crystal and light. "I do not understand you." Human. That is okay, Lyra said, closing her eyes to rest. Neither does anyone else in this galaxy. But she knew that was about to change. She had survived the culling trials. And now the real work could begin. Now she would show them what humans could truly become when pushed beyond every limit that nature had given them. Now, she would make them remember her name. The weeks following the culling trials transformed Lyra Vance from a joke into an obsession that spread through the Celestin Academy like wildfire, consuming dry grass scientists from the Academy's research division requested permission to study her, sending formal applications that filled her message inbox faster than she could delete them. Cadets who had laughed at her now watched her training sessions in silence, standing at the edges of the practice rooms with expressions that mixed fear and fascination. In equal measures, the betting pools that had once predicted her failure now tried to guess how high her ranking would climb before the final evaluation that would determine the Academy's top graduates. Lyra ignored all of it and continued to train. Her body had changed in ways that even she found surprising when she looked in the mirror each morning. Her muscles harder and more defined than they had ever been on Earth. Her movements sharper and more efficient than when she had first arrived, but the physical changes were nothing compared to what was happening inside her mind. She had memorized the combat styles of every major species in the Confederation, learning their strengths and weaknesses until she could predict their moves. Before they made them, she had studied tactics and strategy until she dreamed in formations and flanking maneuvers and supply line logistics. She had transformed herself into something that had never existed before in galactic history. A human warrior forged in the fires of an alien academy that had tried to destroy her one night. Desik found her in their quarters, wrapping bandages around hands that were bruised and bleeding from another marathon training session. The Valkyrie had changed over the past weeks. The contempt in those crystalline eyes slowly replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. "May I ask you something?" Desik said, sitting on the edge of the bed that had once seemed so much larger than the one given to the human. Lyra nodded without looking up from her work. "How did you do it?" "Do what?" "All of it," Desik said, and there was frustration in the crystalline voice that Lyra had never heard before. "How did you survive the trials when every measurement said you should have failed in the first round?" Lyra finished wrapping her hands and looked up at her roommate. "I did fail," she said, over and over again, in every way that mattered to anyone watching. "But you won, because winning and failing are not opposites," Lyra said. "At least not for humans." Desik made a sound of confusion that rang like bells in a windstorm. "That makes no sense." Lyra smiled and leaned back against the wall, thinking about how to explain something that had never needed to be explained on Earth, because every human understood it in their bones. "Your species evolved on a planet of living crystal," she said. "A world where everything was ordered and beautiful and deadly in ways that were predictable and could be avoided if you were smart enough." Desik nodded slowly. "Our world was different," Lyra continued. "Earth tried to kill us every single day for 200,000 years, and it used a different method each time." She held up her damaged hands and looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. "We did not have armor like the Korvath, or speed like the Vryn, or poison like the Kasith. So we learned to survive in other ways." "What ways?" "Persistence," Lyra said, and the word hung in the air between them like something sacred. "Humans are pursuit predators, which means our ancestors did not catch their prey by being faster or stronger. They caught it by following it for days and days until it collapsed from exhaustion." She looked at Desik with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than 26 years. "We are built to not stop," she said. "Our bodies are designed to keep moving when every other species would have given up. Our minds are wired to ignore pain and exhaustion and fear because stopping meant death on a world that never stopped trying to kill us. Desic was quiet for a long moment, processing this information through a crystalline brain that had never encountered such a concept. "You mentioned fear," the Valkyrie finally said. "But I have seen you fight, and you do not seem afraid." Lyra laughed. "And it was not a happy sound. I am always afraid," she said. "Every moment of every day since I arrived at this academy, I have been terrified in ways I cannot describe." "Then how do you fight?" Lyra stood up and walked to the window that looked out at the stars scattered across the black void of space. "Because fear is not a weakness for humans," she said. "It is a tool, the most powerful tool we have." She turned back to face Desic, and there was something ancient and dangerous in her expression that made the crystalline being feel cold in ways that crystal should never feel. "Most species in this galaxy evolved past their survival instincts a long time ago," Lyra said. "They became comfortable and safe and secure in their power, and they forgot what it meant to be prey." She stepped closer to Desic, and the Valkyrie found that she could not look away. "Humans never forgot," Lyra said. "We spend our entire existence being hunted by everything, by animals and nature and disease and each other. And that fear carved itself into our souls so deeply that we can never be rid of it." Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "We learned that pain is just information, and death is just a problem to be solved, and fear is the fire that burns away everything except the absolute need to survive." Desic felt something shift in the way she understood the universe. A crack forming in beliefs that had seemed solid as crystal only moments before. "That is why you keep getting up," the Valkyrie said. "Because you are afraid of what will happen if you stay down." "Yes," Lyra said. "And that fear will drive me further than any of the advantages your species or any other was born with." She walked toward the door, heading back to the training halls where she would spend another night preparing for challenges that should have been impossible. "Wait," Desic called out. "Where are you going?" Lyra paused at the doorway and looked back over her shoulder. "The final evaluation is in 3 weeks," she said. "And I have a record to break." She left, and Desic sat alone in the quarters they shared, staring at the stars and thinking about a species that had turned fear itself into a weapon. The next morning, the Valkyrie did something that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. She asked Lyra if she could train with her. It was the beginning of something new, an alliance between crystal and flesh that would change both of them in ways they could not predict. And across the academy, others began to notice the strange human who should have broken, but had only grown stronger. They began to wonder if perhaps they had underestimated not just Lyra Vance, but her entire species. They began to wonder what else humans might be capable of when pushed beyond every limit that the universe had tried to impose. They began, for the first time in their lives, to feel just a little bit afraid of the soft pink creatures from the small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy, and that fear was the most human thing they had ever experienced. The final evaluation was the most important test in the history of the Celestine Academy. A challenge so difficult that no cadet in 600 years had ever achieved a perfect score. Highest mark ever recorded was 94.7%, held by a Korvath war prince named Varth, who had gone on to become the most decorated commander in the Galactic Confederation's history. Today, Lyra Vance intended to do what no one believed was possible. The test was a live-fire command scenario, where each cadet would lead a team through a simulated planetary siege, making decisions that would determine whether their soldiers lived or died in conditions designed to break even the strongest. Mines teams had been assigned randomly by the Academy's AI, which meant that Lyra found herself standing in front of 5 cadets who represented the bottom of the Academy's rankings. There was Crix, a blind Selenith navigator whose species relied on echolocation rather than sight, a trait that other species saw as a weakness rather than the advantage it truly was. There was Melora, a Korvath engineer who had been labeled a failure because she refused to fight. Preferring to build and create rather than destroy, there was Yenis, the nervous Selenith medic who froze under pressure and had failed every combat simulation she had ever attempted. There was Tessic, who had chosen to join Lyra's training sessions and had improved enough to rise from the very bottom of the rankings, but was still considered one of the weakest cadets in the academy. And there was Yin, a small Vrin who moved slowly by the standards of his species due to a birth defect that had marked him as lesser since the day he emerged from his Egvi. Other teams looked at Lyra's group and laughed, seeing only a collection of broken pieces that could never form a functional whole. Lyra looked at her team and saw something else entirely. She saw potential that no one else had bothered to recognize. The simulation began with a blare of alarms and a rush of chaos as the teams were dropped onto a battlefield where everything was designed to kill. The enemy forces surrounded their position from every direction. Artillery rained from the sky, and the objectives they needed to capture were scattered across a landscape of death and destruction. Other teams charged forward with strength and speed, trusting in their natural advantages to carry them through as they had always done before. Lyra gathered her team in a defensive position and began giving orders that made no sense to anyone watching from the observation platforms above. Crix, close your eyes and listen, she said to the blind navigator. Tell me where the enemy is moving before they get there. The Selenith nodded and reached out with senses that could detect vibrations and sounds beyond the range of any other species in the simulation. Malara, I do not need you to fight, Lyra said to the pacifist engineer. I need you to build, create traps and barriers that will funnel our enemies into kill zones where we can take them out without risking ourselves. The Corvat's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like hope. Yenis, you will stay at the back of our formation and do what you do best, Lyra said to the nervous medic. Keep us alive, heal our wounds, and do not worry about fighting because that is not your job. The anxious Selenith straightened slightly, relief flooding through her at the knowledge that she would not be forced to do something she was never meant to do. Thesic, you are with me on offense, Lyra said to her crystalline roommate. We will draw their attention and their fire while the others work. And what about me? Zoan asked, the small Vrin's voice quiet with the expectation of being told to stay behind where he could not slow the team down. Lyra knelt down to look the Vrin in the eyes. You may be slow by Vrin standards, she said, but you are still faster than almost everyone else on this battlefield. And I need someone who can get to places quickly when the situation changes. Zan stared at her for a long moment before nodding with a determination that had been buried under years of being told he was not good enough. Tell me where to go, he said, and I will be there. The battle unfolded in ways that no one had predicted. Crix's echolocation detected enemy movements before they happened, allowing the team to set ambushes instead of walking into the Melora, built traps that turned the enemy's strength against them, creating choke points where superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantageous, kept the team alive through injuries that would have ended other simulations. Her healing abilities finally given the chance to shine in a role that suited her naturothesic fought beside Lyra with a ferocity that surprised even herself. The crystalline warrior channeling the fear she had learned to embrace from her human friend, and Zun moved between positions with a purpose he had never felt before, carrying messages and supplies and providing support wherever it was needed most. But the final assault was more than even this team could handle through tactics. Alone, the objective was a fortress, defended by forces that outnumbered them 50-1, with firepower that would destroy them long before they could get close enough to breach the walls. Other teams had tried direct assaults and failed, their members eliminated one by one until nothing remained but scattered survivors retreating to safety. Lyra looked at the fortress and then looked at her team. And she made a decision that would be studied at the Academy for centuries to come. "Stay behind me," she said. "And when the path is clear, take the objective," before anyone could stop her. She walked out of cover and into the open field that separated them from the fortress. Every turret and drone and automated defense system turned toward her, and once fire erupted from 100 directions. Energy weapons and projectiles and explosives all converging on the single human who had dared to challenge them alone. Lyra's team screamed for her to retreat, to take cover, to stop this madness before it was too late. She did not stop for 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. Lyra Vance absorbed firepower that was meant for an entire battalion. Her armor shattered in the first 30 seconds. Her bones broke in the first minute. Pain flooded her nervous system in waves that would have driven any other species into unconsciousness, but she kept moving forward, one step at a time, drawing every weapon toward her position while her team flanked around the edges of the battlefield. She fired back when she could, taking down targets with shots that had no right to hit their marks. Her human stubbornness refusing to accept that she should already be dead by the time she finally fell. Her team had infiltrated the fortress and captured every objective without losing a single member. The simulation ended with a sound like thunder, and the massive screens throughout the observation arena displayed the results. DAM. Vance. Score. 100% new Academy RCL art. Silence that followed was deafening. 600 years of history had just been rewritten by a species that had been ranked dead last on the day of their arrival. The rankings on the central spire updated in real time, and 4,000 cadets watched as the name at the bottom climbed all the way to the very top. CADT. Lyra Vance, Terran human, rank 1 out of 2. TO Jones medical. Teams rushed to the arena floor where Lyra lay broken and bleeding, her body destroyed in ways that would take weeks to fully heal, even with the most advanced technology the Academy possessed. As they carried her past the other cadets, she passed Vorth, the Korvath war prince whose record she had just shattered. He stared at her with an expression that mixed disbelief and something that might have been terror. "What are you?" he whispered. Lyra, barely conscious and held together by nothing but willpower and spite, managed to turn her head and smile at him through bloody lips. "Human," she said, was the only answer that mattered. 3 years later, Commander Lyra Vance stood on the bridge of the Confederation flagship, the first human admiral in the history of the Galactic Fleet. Behind her, Earth's application for full Confederation membership had been approved unanimously, not because the other species wanted humans as allies, but because they were too afraid of what might happen if they said no. Academy had taught the galaxy something that humans had always known about themselves, a truth that was written in their bones and their blood and their stubborn, impossible souls. Humans did not know when to quit, and that made them the most terrifying species in the universe. Lyra looked out at the stars and thought about the small blue planet where her journey had begun. A world of oceans and mountains and billions of people who had spent their entire existence refusing to die. She smiled. The galaxy had no idea what was coming, but they would learn. They would all learn.